back to the Western Edge for another installment of my anthology, What the Tide Brings In. This next story is titled Everyone Breaks, and simply put, it's from one of my largest series of Light and Shadows. It's a little blurb into the life of a character I've called the Caretaker. And anyone who bothers to go to Amazon and read my books will understand that Light and Shadows is a very long and very detailed story that I came up with when I was still in high school. And this one little short story is just a little piece in the larger maze that I made of this, rather epic tale. So sit back, hopefully you'll subscribe for more, because there are more coming, and enjoy. Everyone Breaks. Impact, formerly Astoria, Oregon, May 8th, 2173. Silence was key in this place. After the world had fallen, everything had become much quieter, at least around here. This place had been ground zero when it all happened, according to the legends. The place had laughingly been renamed after the near devastation that it had somehow missed out on. To be honest, the most devastation that had come had happened to the residents. The buildings had been left largely intact, and the landscape, while tainted for at least a couple of generations, had eventually grown back. He'd heard tell of the legends that had passed through this place more than once. He'd even learned that the last of them had supposedly perished just across the river, in the one place that no one was said to be able, or perhaps allowed, to ever go. Origin, the place where the Darkfall had come from, supposedly, was off limits to everyone, it seemed, courtesy of a mysterious caretaker that had taken place over some time ago. He didn't know the caretaker's full legend, but he knew that any way into Origin was well blocked or impassable at this time, according to the tales. There were a couple of ways to access the place by land, as the peninsula that jutted from the mainland was still connected. But as far as he's been told, no one had set foot in the hallowed place that hadn't been tossed to the dreaded Durgis that lived in the river, or to the mercies of the wide open Pacific Ocean that bordered sat on Origin's western border. None had come back with an honest tale of what had happened, but all agreed on one thing. The caretaker was not a person to be trifled with. A gentle breeze caressed the back of his neck as he sat on the wild grasses that dotted the banks here and there, overlooking the river and giving him a good view of the broken remnants of what had once, according to legends, been a mighty bridge that had spanned the whole width of the river. The water that lapped against the broken stone spars that remained occasionally showed just a small part one of the river guardians, the great, massive fish that would not hesitate to end the life of anyone who dared enter their territory. The Durgis, large, heavily scaled denizens that ruled the river for miles upon miles, were not his problem right now, though. He had a plan as to how to get around them. It was the idea of what he might do, or what he might say once he was across the river. It was the thought of how he would tell the caretaker that he was his son. The family histories that he'd been given had been so eroded over time that it was hard to know if his mother had been correct in claiming that they were part of the same line as the caretaker, or if she'd been imagining things when she met the man. She'd been to Origin, that he didn't doubt, but his parentage was still something he questioned, but never to her. But promising a woman on her deathbed that he would seek out his father, be it a real claim or not, wasn't something he meant to take lightly. The matter of how to get across was simple enough, as he'd always been the most adventurous among his friends for many years, and didn't seem to fear anything, least of all death. He had a healthy respect for the human condition and what it meant, but seeing as how he didn't share a lot of the weaknesses that regular humans had, thanks to his father, his mother had said, he was less afraid and more curious to see if his current plan would work. He brought along a diversion for the Durgis, but without knowing just how smart they really were, he could only hope that it would work. For crossing the river, he knew that a boat would have been suicide, but the suit he now wore would be a little more reliable. He'd had it for so long now that he had to patch it and replace parts of it to keep it serviceable. But the flying suit, as his mother called it, was actually a suit that had, in the world before, been designed to allow human beings to glide along the wind currents and make their way safely to the ground. or so he'd been told. The challenge here was that he wasn't going to be jumping from a great height, just enough to hopefully catch a useful updraft that would elevate him from one broken spar to another, thereby allowing him to glide across the river. It was a foolhardy plan at best, and an extremely dangerous one to be sure, but it could work. He lived near a river for long enough to know that thermals, or pockets of warm air, existed near riversides and could even allow one to glide for a good distance before they needed to find another one. He'd become quite good with this suit, but this was going to be the ultimate test. It might even be his last. Considering that his mother was gone and he had no one else, he could live with that. It's not too late to turn back. The voice, which came from seemingly nowhere, startled him so badly that he lost his footing as he spun around, thinking to grab for the long knife he carried at his belt, but failing as he landed hard on his butt. The figure that had spoken remained standing a good arm's length away, his features emotionless or perhaps a little perturbed. It was hard to tell. Who are the one telling you to go back? The man said. That's who. The stranger in front of him was dressed in an old style that he'd only seen in books, with what looked like faded blue jeans, what could have been ancient sneakers on his feet, and some sort of light jacket that was made from a material that was similar to that of his gliding suit. But it wasn't his clothing that really set this man apart. It was his features. Dark, ebon-colored orbs glared at him from beneath bushy brows. A face that looked as though it had been carved from stone and a body that looked much the same made the man look rather dangerous, as though he could pick him up and break him in half. He refused to be afraid, though, and, soon enough, was standing on his feet. "And what if I don't?" he asked defiantly. "What if I decide that my destiny is on the other side of the river?" "It's not," the man said plainly. "You're not my son. You're not my child. I never knew your mother. Much as I've told a number of young men and women that have tried to enter my home in the last several months. Go home, find a wife, and live a nice, long, and peaceful existence, far away from here." There wasn't a lot of give in the man's words, but as he turned to view the river, he knew that he wouldn't be going back. "Your decision," the man said behind him, "and your grave." That widened his eyes as he turned back around, seeing nothing, not even an impression in the grass where the man had been standing. But his resolve was stronger than ever now, though he couldn't really understand why. 40 minutes later. Something had gone horribly wrong. He'd caught the first thermal he could find from the first broken piece of the bridge and been flying high enough to set his plan into motion. The cable and grapnel he'd purchased from a trader just a month ago was new enough and sound enough to allow him to swing from one section to the other, trusting in the gusts of wind that would carry him along. But upon this last jump, something had gone awry. The powerful updraft he felt and started navigating only a few moments ago had inexplicably died away, leaving him without anything other than a watery view that exploded quite suddenly into a gaping, tooth-lined maw that rose from the river to envelop him. The stranger had been right. It was his funeral and his grave. Origin, formerly the Long Beach Peninsula, Washington. He should have felt guilty, but he didn't. He warned every would-be thrill-seeker and stranger claiming to be his kin away from this place. But no one seemed willing to listen. Even as he stood there watching, he could feel the unseen barrier he'd erected around this place being penetrated for the third time in as many months, and the second time today. Sighing to himself, the caretaker flexed his will and instantly disappeared from the spot he'd selected to watch the demise of the young man who had sought to enter this place, ready to toss another dim-witted soul to the wilds. Willapa Bay. Nakata. She'd done what no one else before her had done, in her mind. She'd breached the boundary of origin. Oh, how her father would look at her if he was here to see. He'd probably soil himself to realize that the fruit of his loins, a woman he thought was utterly worthless since the day she was born, had done something that few people would have been daring enough to try, and it had been so much easier than she believed possible. The monstrous fish that patrolled the dark ribbon that ran between Impact and this place did not stretch the boundaries to the bay that separated the peninsula from the mainland. While many knew this fact, they didn't know why. It was because other creatures called the bay home, and while they weren't quite as vicious as the dreaded Durges, they were every bit as deadly. The giant harbor seals, the immense demon crabs, and the rumored Leviathan that lurked at the deepest parts of the bay were all stories that she and many others of eastern Washington had been told as children, and she had no reason to doubt them. In fact, she could easily swear that she had seen a large, ominous shadow looming below her canoe, even as she'd been doing her best to fend off the few crabs and seals that dared to come close. The electrical panels that were rigged to the bottom of her canoe, called thumpers, had dissuaded many of those creatures that would have otherwise tried to sink her, but a few of the bravest had still felt the bite of the blade she always had on her person. Now, however, standing upon the dry and very overgrown shore that had once been a place called Nakata, Marnie couldn't help but smile in satisfaction as she spread her arms wide, savoring the victory for what it was. "Are you done congratulating yourself?" The hooked blades that were harnessed on her back were in her hands, and the next second she opened her eyes, assuming a ready stance as she dropped into a crouch, watching the man standing several yards away as he just stared at her, or, rather, glared at her. "I haven't seen weapons like those in a while," he mused. "Do you know how to use them?" Her immediate response was to bite back as hard as she could. But as she looked upon the strangely dressed individual, she found him more amenable to be polite and not overly confrontational. "Are you the caretaker of this place, I mean?" she asked. Marnie felt foolish in that moment as the words came tumbling out. But as the man hefted his own weapon, a white staff that seemed to glow from within... Wait, where did that come from? She hadn't seen it just a moment ago when she opened her eyes. What the hell? "I am," he replied simply, "and now that we've got that out of the way, you were just about to turn around and leave." Marnie's temper rose quickly once more as she cocked her head, smiling faintly as she replied, "Only if you can make me." The caretaker shook his head as he twirled his staff once. Why were they always so foolish? The fight didn't last that long, but she wasn't the worst combatant he'd come against in a while. She was better than some that had thought they were born fighters, but like all the rest, she'd gone down with a few solid hits. This was no longer the world where hitting a woman was taboo, and in a place where survival meant letting go of your morals at times, nothing was forbidden. The beating the caretaker gave Marnie was nothing short of humiliating, but the result was almost worse than the fight itself, as he left her broken and bleeding upon the shore where she'd beached her canoe, easy prey for anything that wanted to come along for a quick bite. He then walked away without another word, his staff disappearing from his grasp as it did. As far as Marnie was concerned, getting away with her life as she drifted across the bay was a bigger victory than having reached Origin in the first place. August 30th, 2173. He sighed as the image of another individual attempting to cross the bay near the northern end, where the mouth of Willapa Bay met the Pacific Ocean, came to mind. People didn't often stop when they were denied anything, as it quickly became an obsession, something they just had to have or had to conquer. Origin had become, to some, a type of holy place, but also a danger zone to be avoided. He'd heard the legends, the tales, and several of the stories. After all, he didn't stay here all the time. But not once when he'd been gone had this place been breached. Only when he was back home did the barrier allow anyone to pass through. Sealing this place off from the world on a continual basis was not a good idea, as the creatures that lived within the wilds of this place would surely become unhinged if they weren't allowed to roam. Things came and went on Origin, but he was the one constant that never seemed to change throughout the long history of the place since the end of the world. He loved, he lived, and he'd even broken a little during his time on this world. It was inevitable, really. No matter how powerful a person was, everyone could break at some point, and the things he'd seen had done this for him in their due course. But each time he'd broken, he had defied the laws of physics and metaphysics alike, and had come back stronger, more determined, and far more powerful than before. He was not human, though he looked it, and as such he did not bear a great many of their weaknesses. But the heart, as always, was the biggest weakness of all, and many years ago he'd done away with as much of his as he could bear. He didn't care one bit for those who tried to reach this place, nor would he be merciful to any of them that made it to shore. Origin was meant to be left alone, just as he was, and if people couldn't understand that, then they were walking into their own doom. Speaking of which, there was a fool out on the north end of Ledbetter Point to deal with just now. Ledbetter Park. It went without saying that he probably shouldn't be here, but of all the places he's been in his life, no place had ever pulled him closer than this one. He lived across the bay for longer than many, but never had he dared to come to the shore. It wasn't just the monsters that lived in the bay, and it wasn't even the legend of the caretaker who was said to expel or kill anyone who dared to cross the distance. It was that he knew what it meant to respect something, and someone. Whoever this caretaker was, Seth had always felt that he didn't expel people just because he felt like it. There had to be a reason why the individual felt the need to keep this place private. He'd studied as much history as he could find about this place called Origin. He learned about the native tribes that once called it home, and how they'd been rid off by the white settlers and promised land, but still never been given what had once been rightfully theirs. He read about how it had changed throughout the years, how it had become a permanent residence for so many, a logging town, a vacation destination, and eventually a place where people had congregated in great numbers to enjoy themselves. The histories had ended shortly after the year 2000, however, as the tragedy that had befallen the world had come. He'd only been alive for the past century, but he'd known enough about the land called Origin to know that it was sacred ground to some, and a curiosity to others. Simply setting foot on it was not something one did with impunity, especially not given the current history of the place. It was, after all, where the Chosen had been born. The caretaker stopped short, unable to proceed as he felt his senses fuzz over for a moment. He'd felt the presence of an interloper only a moment ago, but now it was gone, almost as though something was blocking it. That hadn't happened in a while, but he knew what it meant at least. Growling with frustration, he looked around the area he transported himself to, looking for anything out of place or anyone who didn't belong here, which would mean anyone. But he was looking for someone specific. "Come on out already," he said in a gruff voice. "If you want to talk, hiding isn't the way to go." A light chuckle reached his ears as he spun around on one heel, lifting his other foot as he did. From behind a broken-down old colonial-style home came the form of a woman he'd not seen in a long, long time. The reason for this was that she died in his arms many years ago. Her infectious smile, tan skin, and long, wavy locks reminded him of that long-ago day when he'd held her close and watched the life fade from her eyes. In this moment, however, the sight only made him angry. "You know, your lack of hospitality has become a thing of legend," said the Creator, smiling up at him as the form of his sister stopped only a few yards away. "People are so fearful of this place. Only the most foolish and the bravest will even dare to cross the river or the bay." "What do you want?" he asked in a gruff tone. It wasn't every day he got to speak to an avatar of the only being in this or any other reality who could challenge him. But as usual, it wasn't a pleasant meeting. "So forceful," the Creator chided, forcing a mild pout on the sister's features. The caretaker wanted so badly to crush this avatar as he'd done to others, but he restrained himself for the moment. "You remember what happened to the last form you sent my way?" the caretaker asked with a mild sadistic grin. The Creator nodded. "I do." There was no concern on his sister's stolen features, only a mild grin that told him that the Creator didn't fear him, as always. That was fine. The caretaker didn't give a damn if he was feared. "You need to speak to this one," the Creator said, the voice of his sister coming forth with all sincerity. "He's not like the others that think of this place as a prize." "Then why is he here?" the caretaker asked. He was already tired of this conversation, but he would listen simply because he had nothing better to do, other than anything. "He's here because I brought him here." The caretaker's eyes widened at that moment, as the Creator had known this was the wrong thing to say. "Calm down before you..." The caretaker cut the creator off before anything more could be said, grabbing the form of his sister by the throat and hoisting her high enough that he had to look up at her. The creator knew very well that a fight between the two of them would never be an easy thing, but in the current form of war, the caretaker would always be able to triumph, as his power came from the reality that he inhabited, as well as those he didn't. In short, the caretaker was a wellspring through which energy simply flowed, and he knew how to make good use of it without any trouble. "Where?" the caretaker demanded, not bothering to explain his question. Cemetery, the creator gurgled, hating just how powerless the Avatar had become in so short a time. It wasn't really a surprise when the caretaker crushed the throat of the form the creator had taken, letting it drop as the life of the being expired, forcing the creator to abandon it as it had so many at this point. The form of the caretaker's sister evaporated like so much mist, leaving only the unmarred ground beneath as the creator's essence watched the caretaker vanish. Oysterville Cemetery. He could feel the strangeness of this place just by walking past the front gates, but he could also feel the energy emanating from the gray ground around him as well. Something monumental had happened here, but what it could have been, he had no idea. The headstones within the graveyard were all weathered, covered in moss, old, beaten down by time and the elements, and yet most of them still stood. A few laid around here and there, in pieces, seeming as though they'd been shattered or broken by some tremendous amount of force. There was no doubt a battle had been fought here, but long ago. Seth couldn't even imagine what kind of forces had run rampant in this place, nor did he want to. But he'd been drawn here for a reason, and he meant to find out why. Even as he was walking forward, however, a voice stopped him in his tracks, forcing him to turn around slowly as he felt the blood in his veins turn to ice. "You need to leave." Seth felt his mouth go dry as he looked upon the shadowed form of the caretaker, his eyes widening under that dark, raven-black stare. The air within the cemetery appeared to grow colder, almost frigid, as he could swear that he felt a static charge building as the hairs on his arms stood up ever so slightly. What was going on? Was the caretaker really that powerful? I'm sorry, Seth replied, licking his lips as he had to restrain himself from taking a step back. He'd seen wild animals that would give chase the moment a person didn't stand their ground, and for some reason he had the idea that the caretaker wasn't too far removed from doing the same thing he proposed. Seth knew that being here was violating an unspoken rule that many had learned to follow, but he couldn't leave without finding what he'd come for. "Be sorry on your way out," the caretaker said, going silent again as that dark, solid black stare penetrated Seth just a little more. The caretaker frowned slightly, cocking his head to the side as he said, "You're an immortal." Seth was caught off guard, but he couldn't help his reply. "Yeah, he swallowed. "I'm an Elevane. I know what an Elevane is," the caretaker said gruffly. His beard and mustache barely moved as he spoke, but his eyes were still what transfixed Seth the most. They were dark pools that you could easily imagine many had fallen into, perhaps to their peril. An Elevane was an immortal being that was slightly less powerful than their cousins, the Shapers. It had long been rumored that the caretaker was one or the other, as it was said that he'd been a part of Origin for an exceptionally long time. But being here now, Seth didn't get any of the same feeling he did from his own kind. He did get the impression that this man was quite powerful, and that crossing him would be a huge mistake. "Why are you here?" the caretaker asked, surprising him. Seth had expected demand for him to leave again, and perhaps even to be struck for daring to stand in this man's presence for more than a few seconds. He certainly hadn't expected this. Licking his lips nervously again, he looked around at the greenery of the cemetery that surrounded him, wondering for just a split second on what to say. Finally, he worked up the nerve and the words came spilling out. "My name is Seth Tideson," he said with at least some confidence, "and I've come for what's left of my father." "Your father?" the caretaker asked, lowering his gaze slightly. "Tideson." The caretaker's eyes widened almost imperceptibly as he looked back at Seth. Poseidon. Seth, still nervous but resolute enough as he heard the name of his estranged father, merely nodded. He was indeed the son of another Elevane, a rather powerful one that had passed, as he'd been told, in battle not terribly long ago. What little he'd been told was that the immortal turned deity had been part of a group that had struck a bargain to go after one of the Chosen, the last of them, in fact, and they had lost. They had lost everything. But more importantly, they had lost the one thing that no Elevane wanted to lose. As the caretaker drew something forth from his pocket, Seth's heart nearly stopped in his chest as he saw it. A symbol, no larger than a nectarine in width and height, rested in the caretaker's fist. The symbol looked as though it was made of some type of metal, but as Seth already knew, it couldn't be sundered or even destroyed as easily as any metal. It was the focus of an immortal, an Elevane's heart, in other words. His kind only assumed physical form. But since they were composed of pure energy, they could dismiss this form at will, but only so long as they possessed their focus, the very heart of their being. As he had suspected, his father's was shaped in the likeness of the famed trident that he'd carried for so long, the three-pronged head of the weapons looking sleek and quite vicious. "How did you come by this?" Seth managed, looking upon the symbol with something akin to awe. "Your father fought the champion of the Chosen in open combat," the caretaker said, an almost wistful note coming to his voice, "and he lost." "The champion," Seth breathed. "He took trophies?" "Not trophies," the caretaker grumbled, but he couldn't bear to see an immortal sent to the colony without good purpose. Seth knew what he meant, as the focus of an Elevane was the only thing that kept them from joining the energies of this world upon their passing, or when assuming another form. Without their focus, they would revert back to the primordial force from which they'd sprung, lost until another day when their energy was transferred to another. "How did you get it?" Seth asked suddenly, cocking his head in curiosity. The caretaker just looked at Seth, his dark eyes revealing nothing. "You?" Seth murmured. "You murdered my father? You're the champion?" "You're a smart kid," the caretaker said quietly, putting the symbol back in his pocket. "But I can't give you this." Seth's eyes widened as he felt anger burning deep inside his chest. Who was this man to deny him anything? Good sense tried to plant a seed of reason within his mind, to still the fire in his heart. But seeing the symbol of his father had caused his rage to rise to the boiling point immediately. Learning that this man had killed his father, whom he'd only seen a few times, but was still kind to, was close to pushing him past the reverence he'd had for this place. "I defeated him, along with many others that claimed the title of God," the caretaker said. "They decided I was a threat, and in doing so decided to come for me in this place. But your father, he at least tried to fight me alone, the last little bit of honor he had left." "What do you know about honor?" Seth blurted out suddenly. "You murdered my father!" "If that's the way you want to see it, then so be it," the caretaker said, a white staff having suddenly appeared in his hands as he planted at one end of the ground, leaning idly upon it as he looked almost bored. "You think you're the only one that can manifest weapons?" Seth sneered, feeling uncharacteristically cocky as he glared at the caretaker. Good sense had fled. It wanted nothing to do with what was about to happen. "Don't do it, kid," the caretaker said. "Your father's still technically alive as long as I hold this. Don't join him." This was more than Seth could bear as he felt the power within his being flare up, granting him strength as he felt the familiar haft of the weapon he'd spent decades mastering how to use form in his right hand. The solid grip of the trident was comforting as it formed completely from the motes of light he'd summoned. "My father will be avenged. Seth frowned as he sought to finish the last word, but his mouth would no longer work as he suddenly realized that he could no longer see the caretaker. What he did see was a statue, which was rather curious. An angel wielding a sword and kneeling upon a rock, or perhaps something else, sat in front of him, only a few yards away. The statue's expression was one of grief, or perhaps his mind was making that up. It didn't matter, however. In fact, nothing really mattered any longer as he felt a sudden tug from within his body. The core of his being, exiting his form as the calling, that damnable fate to which all of his kind were relegated, began to draw him forward, upward, backward, sideways. After a moment, direction lost all meaning, as did time. The only thing that mattered any longer was nothing at all, and soon, he couldn't even remember that much. The creator sighed at his new avatar. This one, a form that the caretaker had not seen before, spoke from the entrance to the graveyard. Was that necessary? He sought the remains of his father, nothing more. And if any one of them comes back, the whole mess starts again, and this world will need another cleansing, according to someone. He wasn't ready for that, and neither am I. Sooner or later, your purpose will find you again, the Creator said as the caretaker made his way from the cemetery. The Creator never even saw the strike that destroyed this current avatar, but its annoyance was great as it could sense the caretaker walking off, as though nothing had happened. The end. Well, that was another story from my anthology. I hope y'all enjoyed it. Working on getting more videos out every Tuesday and Thursday. Hope you'll come back and at least listen to what I have to offer. Maybe I'll do a couple of opinion pieces and I can figure out movie reactions. I might even do those. Till then, this is Tom from the Western Edge saying keep it real and do your thing.